Chilis populating every island and trying to control the indigenous population, which was going to be an ongoing process. And they meant a significant loss of life for everybody involved.
And as those sources of labor themselves become scarce or become harder to access, the Spanish begin to turn to trade with the Portuguese, and enslaved Africans quickly come in and are used both in domestic service, in cities like Santo Domingo, in rural service, working as ranchers and cowboys to maintain livestock supplies, as well as to work in the mines, and eventually to work on sugar plantations, which begin to be established in the first couple decades of the 16th century.
When the gold in Hispaniola starts declining, there's going to be a very conscious move towards sugar as the next most important commodity that the island can produce. So Hispaniola is really the first sugar plantation in the Americas.
We know that in many places like Santo Domingo, the population of enslaved Africans came to meet, or in some cases exceed, the number of Spaniards.
However, back in Europe, the crown faced a growing opposition to the brutality of its state-sponsored privateers. Amongst the most famous of the early objectors was Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, a man who had already formed his own complicated relationship with the Indies.
Bartolomé de las Casas came out to the New World as a young man. He settled on the island of Hispaniola. He participated in the invasion of Cuba, and as a result of his participation in the invasion of Cuba, was made an encomendero, that is, he was given a grant of Indians who would pay tribute to him.
In 1511, we heard Antonio de Montesinos preaching a sermon against the abuses of the indigenous peoples who were living in these kind of encomenderos, the cruelty, the kind of dehumanization.
Bartolomé de las Casas then goes through a spiritual transformation. He renounces his encomienda, and he then decides to join the Dominican order. Montesinos had been a Dominican.
And then he became a lifelong advocate for indigenous rights. He's called the Apostle of the Indies. He goes known as the Apostle of the Indies.
He was one of the first ones to denounce the quick disappearance of indigenous people and try to actually exert some action from the crown. He tried to advocate for some legislation to protect indigenous people.
His idea was that it was essential to remove natives from the grasp of conquistadors, because that would only lead to their complete extinction.
He is a very, very important figure. Even at the time, you will read correspondence which talks about that Dominican or the Bishop of Chiapas and his troublemaking. So his message was loud and clear, and it was heard in the highest levels of government.
The crown was shocked by this. So this is not what the church and the God have set us out to do. Spain enacts the laws of Gilbert, which begins to delineate how Spaniards will treat native people.
The problem, of course, is that from theory to practice there is a long distance, so even though at a certain point indigenous slavery is going to be prohibited, there is always going to be an asterisk to the law. There's always going to be ways in which Spaniards can, if not disobey the law, definitely walk around it.
One such loophole was officially recognized existence as Spanish law, only a year after the creation of the laws of Lobos.
A jurist in Spain named Justo Palacios created a document that was called the Requerimiento, that means the requirement. Palacios laid out a religious and legal rationale for the enslavement and total domination of people of the Americas. If the people accept, then they will be treated well, says the document. If they do not accept, they will be enslaved, and their children and wives will be taken away, they will be killed. This document made possible things that would not otherwise have been imaginable. Then, from the Spanish point of view, all of these actions were legitimate.
It's a loophole that's absolutely massive. It's a loophole that you can just sail an entire conquest expedition right through. And that's what the Spaniards do. So the Caribbean very quickly becomes a colonial disaster.
But violence was not the Spaniards' only import to the Caribbean. Their arrival in the Caribbean began a complex biological experiment, which would leave a lasting impact on the Western Hemisphere.
The Caribbean is a laboratory of empire for Spain. It is at this time that you find many of the elements you're going to find later in colonial culture in other places of the world. They happen first here. They're going to try at least to introduce agricultural products into the Caribbean with little success. Things like wheat, things like grapes to make wine, things like cattle, like horses, pigs, dogs as well.
They also carry the first diseases from the old world, particularly what we think about now as swine flu. Within a decade, all the settlements had fallen, the animals had either died, been eaten, or had run off into the frontier, and diseases had begun to spread, particularly swine flu, amongst native populations. So it's an abject failure, the first settlements that Columbus launched. But more broadly, the whole colonial enterprise in the Caribbean itself is very much similarly a failure through the early period until the mainland becomes the focus.
We know that relatively early on, there were many instances of rape perpetrated by Spaniards on indigenous people. But as you moved into the early 16th century, there were some cases where you see more intentional relationships between Spaniards and indigenous women that then lead to children that are more part of the Spanish world than part of indigenous communities. Eventually, by the 1520s, the Spanish have coined a new word to describe the children born between Spaniards and typically indigenous women. And these children are called mestizos, which has the same root as the word mixture, right? So these are mixed people.
Having passed away shortly after Columbus's return, Queen Isabella's power had been inherited by an unsympathetic King Ferdinand. He continued to reject increasingly desperate requests from the disgraced explorer for the reinstatement of his privileges. Time had run out for Christopher Columbus. He died in obscurity on the 20th of May, 1506, at only 55 years old.
Columbus was obviously important because he was so tremendously wrong about what he sought to do. He, of course, is a very controversial figure. He was controversial during his lifetime. We have to recognize that due to his efforts, the Spaniards did create a colony. They did create a permanent presence in the New World. And that permanent presence then acted as the jumping off place for further expeditions.
In the second voyage, he learned to master the winds and currents of the Atlantic, which are fundamental to cross the ocean in the age of sail. It's the voyage that established the permanent navigational route between Europe and the Iberian Peninsula and the Americas for the next 3 centuries, basically.
He extensively explored the Caribbean, but he also continued to believe that he had found a passageway to the east. He never admitted that he had come across lands that had not been seen or encountered by Europeans before.
In 1498, everyone believes that they were in England earlier. People are drafting an new cartography of the globe that includes these islands that were not a part of India. Most likely, few of the settlers or conquistadors thought they were actually in India either.
The Spanish mission to peacefully Christianize the Caribbean may have been a failure, but the establishment of colonies on Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuba would land the conquistadors with an incredible opportunity.
The Caribbean was a proving ground wherein the Spaniards were able to identify and practice strategies of conquest that then would propel them to the mainland, where they would be able to use those conquests against new peoples in the search for more tribute, more labor, more income, ultimately more lands for their monarch.
Things like the encomienda is practiced and experimented with in the Caribbean. Plantations are established in the Caribbean, and settlements with sort of a Spanish center and indigenous periphery are experimented with in the Caribbean.
You had to have a point of focus with sufficient individuals there in order to begin the other discoveries. We have enough people on the islands, we have enough resources to begin to build ships on the island. And so expeditions no longer have to make the 3,000-mile trip all the way from Spain in order to discover new areas. And this dramatically changes the nature of the discoveries. Without a base of operations such as Hispaniola, such as the city of Santo Domingo, the rest of it just would not have happened.
One such expedition in 1513 would see the conquistadors make a pivotal discovery, offering them their first substantial taste of mainland America. The conquistadors were coming from Panama.
Panama was the first major mainland conquest after the Caribbean. The campaign led by Pedro Arias Davila was arguably one of the most brutal campaigns of conquest in all of the Americas. Between those years, it's possible that the Spanish decimated as many as 250,000 Cueva peoples in Panama. From Panama, the Spanish are able to establish a new foothold that they quickly realize offers access to another ocean, a monumental discovery for the future course of the conquest of the Americas.
As the second decade of the 16th century draws to a close, one high-ranking politician stuck in an administrative position in Cuba grows anxious for adventure. Hernan Cortés soon sets his sights on the mainland, intoxicated by stories of a legendary city of gold. What lay ahead of him would prove to be one of the greatest and deadliest Spanish conquests, the vast city of Tenochtitlan and the extraordinary empire of the Aztecs.
Bro, 帮我拍，我到了，我载你去布吉巴多。你在那边啊，你帮我排队，我彩礼在布吉巴多，对不对？我带你去布吉巴多。More than enough time to 回来，你讲30个人哦，最少是9点了。
The year is 1517. A quarter of a century has passed
牌。啊，等我载你来了拿号码，我载你去布吉巴多。不是，你排了拿号码就可以了。拿号码，然后我就看阿嘎号码几点，我就懂阿嘎要等多久了。啊，你讲有30个人的话 ，minimum 是9点了。我说你那边帮我排就对了。如果到你了，帮我拿号码；还没有到你的话，来给你 take over。啊 ，OK 啊。啊 ，on the way 了，没有这样快到啦，人家 PIE 一定 jam 的，不知道为什么。OK 啊，可以，好，拜拜。
Remain to be explored. This curious continent offered even greater financial promise. Its potential captivated the ambitious mind of one power-hungry royal bureaucrat, Hernán Cortés. It would be Cortés who would tire of his government position and risk pushing boundaries never before breached by Europeans. But how would he come to discover the greatest civilization the Americas had ever known? Would he really be able to control and defeat the Aztecs?
There was this young man by the name of Hernán Cortés on the island of Cuba. He was an official that worked under the governor of Velázquez. He was very ambitious.
Cortés is a fascinating fellow. He is from Extremadura, the western part of Castile. He was fairly well educated for a man of his time. He comes from the very, very lowest rank of nobility in Spain. Individuals called hijo de algo. That means son of somebody. They come from a noble lineage.
He became a colonist, and he spent some time in Hispaniola, where he was actually a notary. It was like a dead-end job, so he joined the expedition to actually settle the island of Cuba.
Hernán Cortés was smart, and he was ruthless. Rising swiftly through the ranks of the Cuban government, by the age of 33, he had been promoted to municipal magistrate by Governor Diego Velázquez. With this respected position came a generous encomienda, the right to force labor and take whatever he liked, whenever he liked, from the island's indigenous people.
In Cuba, he became quite wealthy, but the truth of the matter is that actually he comes from relative obscurity. He was never the protagonist of any great events in the conquest or colonization or either Hispaniola or Cuba. And it seems that he might have been chosen for the role by Velázquez because Velázquez thought that he could actually manipulate him or keep it under his control.
But Cortés was growing hungry for more. Obsessed by rumors of sophisticated cities constructed of gold, he sought adventure. He dreamt of glory. And where better to fulfill these boyish needs than beyond the confines of the Caribbean? Only there, in Mesoamerica, could he ever rise to become the most famous of all the conquistadors.
So there's a peculiar feature of the Spanish and European presence in the New World. Columbus's voyage was in 1492. And for fully 25 years, a quarter of a century, the Spaniards remained in the Caribbean. But it's because the early Spanish experience in the New World was actually quite disappointing. These were not people, the native Caribbeans, who built large cities. They hadn't accumulated vast amounts of precious metals. Even their agriculture was relatively non-intensive. So in other words, there didn't seem to be much incentive to further Spanish exploration. But during that period, nevertheless, they're sending out feeler expeditions down to Trinidad, along the northern coast of South America, in Venezuela, what's now Colombia, the southern coast of North America, in Florida.
Indigenous mainlanders were wooed and interrogated by the Spanish on these exploratory trips. The colonists sought healthy, farmable land and the labor to work it. And yet just about everything, no matter its long-term potential, paled in comparison to their ultimate desire.
The Spanish had this insatiable thirst for gold. Gold to Spaniards was not just a kind of monetary thing, nor was it a mere embellishment. It was a symbol of honor, grandeur, stature. It had a kind of web of symbolic meanings around it that made it far more than just a precious blood.
12 years after the death of Queen Isabella, the Spanish crown had landed with her grandson, Charles. The young king's desire for total power across Europe required gold. Vast supplies of this precious metal which could buy him his dominance. And who was already exploring the mysteries of the New World, where legend spoke of cities built from this rare treasure? Charles was about to offer the full weight of his support to the conquistadors and Cuba's governor, Diego Velázquez.
Velázquez had commissioned 2 voyages of exploration within the general confines of the Gulf of Mexico.
Francisco Hernández de Córdoba commanded the first expedition to the Yucatan Peninsula. He and his crew faced fierce resistance from the Mayan population. Many never returned. One of a handful of survivors was Bernal Diaz, who returned to Cuba with gripping tales of a highly advanced, vastly powerful civilization.
They had explored part of the Yucatan Peninsula, and they had obviously heard rumors that there were other polities farther north worth exploring.
1 year later, Diaz would return in search of this marvelous, dangerous metropolis. With him was Governor Velázquez's nephew, the explorer Juan de Grijalva, and 200 men armed with gunpowder weaponry. Meanwhile, Cortés grew restless watching from the safety of his dull government office. He yearned for his very own opportunity to storm the mainland and secure its bounty. Diaz's reports of his adventures with Grijalva had reached the ears of Cortés. Gruesome tales of guerrilla warfare in the jungles of Campeche, leading to dozens of fatalities and injuries, including Grijalva being hit by 3 separate arrows and breaking 2 of his teeth. Somehow, he survived. Cortés quietly allowed the rumors to spread. Was Grijalva missing? Or worse, dead? Who would track down and finally bring him home to the safety of his uncle, Governor Velázquez?
The idea that he brought to Velázquez was to go in search of Juan de Grijalva. And so it was initially seen as a recovery mission.
So in 1519,这个很简单的，有一个 company email 给那个 agent， 这个 please contact this lead， please contact this lead 就有那个 black and white 很美了。Then most likely 他们是不会去 trace 那个 marketing company 是做什么的吧？如果有的话，就叫我们的那个 trusted client send 他们一个 email， I've seen this ad on what I'm interested， 这就可以了咯。Ordered by Velázquez to undertake an expedition. Shortly before leading the expedition, Cortés began to put doubts on Velázquez because of his expedition with Europeans. So he changed their mind and told Cortez he was not to sail. The message from the governor got there in time, but Cortez chose to ignore and sailed toward Mexico in 1519.
There are 10 ships, probably some 500 men all told, which is unquestionably the biggest expedition that had been launched at the time. And it becomes clear rather quickly that although Cortez had been telling Velázquez that he was just going to go off and find Grijalva, or he was just going to go off and do more reconnaissance, that he had an ulterior motive. He follows the traditional path to go to the east coast of Yucatan, encounters Maya groups, around to the west coast of Yucatan, and then up the Gulf of Mexico, encountering natives, having battles, taking on water, but also gaining huge amounts of information.
At last, a truly promising discovery. A landscape flush with exotic creatures and colorful plants never before witnessed by European eyes. Populated by an indigenous people whose civilization appeared to be remarkably advanced.
Finally, on Good Friday of 1519, they make a more or less permanent camp near what is now Veracruz, Mexico. They then declare themselves independent and in essence abrogate their contract with Diego Velázquez. They send out smaller expeditions to look at the surrounding area. They entertain emissaries from the Mexica, folks who we call the Aztecs, and make the decision that there is more here than meets the eye.
It was merely the tip of the iceberg. Cortez must have been trembling with excitement. The determined conquistador knew that he and his men were teetering on the precipice of the greatest discovery Europe had ever known, an immeasurable wilderness, home to a countless number of highly developed civilizations and cultures.
So before the arrival of Europeans, the Americas are a really varied and in many places a densely populated landscape. There's peoples in tropical areas, deserts, as well as the Incan highlands or the highlands of the Andes. There are large numbers of peoples in parts of the Amazon basin, and also in the American Midwest around the Mississippi River. The most densely populated regions are in temperate and tropical areas, particularly around central Mexico, what we talk about as Mesoamerica or Middle America. In the north, there are what we talk about as the Aztec and Mexica people who speak Nahuatl. To the south, there are Maya peoples who speak Mayan languages.
So we think of Mesoamerica as this fairly unified cultural area. Even though we have many different native groups, there are certain common cultural aspects which they all share, such as a base 20 number system, such as a complex calendar system. Certainly Mesoamerica was one of the most densely populated areas on the globe.
Back in Cuba, Governor Velázquez was furious. Cortez had actively chosen to ignore his clear and strict orders. He was no longer welcome or safe to return home, and so his only option was whatever lay ahead. If he was to stand any sort of chance at surviving out here, Cortez knew he must find an effective way to communicate with the Maya and Aztec people.
At the beginning of the Cortez expedition, when the Spaniards land on Cozumel, just off the coast of Yucatan, they hear word that some Spaniards who had been shipwrecked there 6 years earlier had survived. And particularly one, called Geronimo de Aguilar, comes running out of the woods. At first they don't even recognize him as a Spaniard. He starts speaking He's been living among the Maya of Yucatan ever since his shipwreck and has learned Maya. He's had to learn Maya in order to survive. He then is incorporated into the expedition. Then when they begin to enter the Aztec Empire, there they have an encounter with a local indigenous group where the men who rule give the Spaniards 20 girls. One of those girls, the Spaniards baptized Dona Marina.
She spoke both Nahuatl and one of the more common Maya languages. So through Dona Marina and Leaila, they could communicate with the vast majority of all native peoples in central Mexico.
Cortez would soon grow reliant on Doña Marina, his translator, negotiator, and indispensable cultural mediator. Without her, Cortez and his men would never have survived.
They then organized themselves in order to go inland. And this is the dramatic moment, because in an expedition of 10 ships, 500 and some men, about half of those men were sailors. They figured that, heck, by June they were going to be home with the wife and kids. And all of a sudden, this guy says, sorry, we're going inland. You have two choices. You can go dandle your child on your knee, or you can become filthy rich. It's up to you. What we then do, we keel haul all the ships and we dismantle them. We take all of the metal fittings, all of the blocks, all of the lines, all the sails, and we store it. The hulks, we burn. Now, a lot of romantic authors of the 19th century have seen this as a cataclysmic moment. You're either with me or you're against me, and I just burned the ships. There's no way you can get home. Well, I mean, that's a delightful idea. It's quite romantic. But the truth is, those ships had been in tropical waters probably for 2 to 3 years by that time. If you leave the ships in the water, they are going to disintegrate. So you might as well pull them out, salvage all the material that you possibly can, because you can always rebuild them. Remember, half of your crew are sailors and the ship's carpenters and all the like. You can rebuild those ships. And so even though we see the burning of the ships as this very dramatic turning point, it really wasn't. It was quite practical.
6 months had passed. Cortez, having explored great lengths of the coastline, was by now highly aware that the region's preeminent power were the mighty Mexica.
The Mexicas, or better known as the Aztecs, were an extraordinarily hierarchical society, not that different to Spanish society in some ways. The leader, known as the Tlatoani of the Aztecs, was in that time Moctezuma.
Their society began in the 11th and 12th century, somewhere to the northwest, in a process of migration that may have lasted 200 years. They entered into the well-watered area of the central basin of Mexico, what we now know as the Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City is located.
They set up a capital in the middle of a lake, Lake Texcoco in central Mexico. From the middle of this lake, they built a capital city, the capital of Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of what the king recognized the Aztec Empire.
The city itself houses as many as 250,000 people, many times the size of London at the same period. And they then use military force to expand their power and control beyond the central basin of Mexico until it encompasses from north central Mexico all the way down into Central America. But the truth is, most of the Aztec Empire was not a formal political entity, but rather it was an imperial system which was based upon the payment of taxes. We'll leave you alone if you pay your taxes to us.
The Mesoamerican tradition, in terms of the independent, almost autonomous resistance community put into the Aztec state.
Folks have calculated that probably as many as 100,000 of us followers then begin to fight alongside of the Spaniards. The Spaniards then move on to the important cultural center of Cholula, where the local elements attempt to annihilate the Spaniards by attacking them in the night, working in concert, we believe, with the Mexica of Mexico City. The Spaniards learn about the plot thanks to Doña Marina and are able to foil it. And then the entire expedition of Spaniards and natives enter into the Valley of Mexico.
Exhausted, filthy, jaded but determined, Cortez and his men finally emerge from the claustrophobic forest. Masterfully crafted waterways flowing through a vast city, overlooked by magnificent pyramids of gold. This was the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. They would likely have been the first Europeans in history to enjoy such a privilege.
Standing on the ridge, looking down into the Central Valley of Mexico, the Central Basin, it would have touched to see a population center of hundreds of thousands of people, and then this crystalline lake with a city placed in the middle.
When we saw all those cities and villages in the water, we rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was nothing a dream. It was all so wonderful, but I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamt of before.
November 8th, 1519. Cortez and his men arrived at the gates of the city. This was a risky tactic, leaving his army open to attack. Perhaps Moctezuma was superstitious, or simply anxious, that the tense atmosphere might tip over into violence. Either way, he offered the Spaniards a peaceful welcome, a decision the Aztec leader would soon come to severely regret.
They're put in one of the palaces in the central religious district of the city.
In the midst of all this splendor, they noticed these large pyramids and the temples, and they started to approach them. And they were horrified to learn that this blood was because of these things.
Of course, human sacrifice for them is horrible, and they continually complain about it. The Mexica seem to diminish it a little bit for their benefit.
As the months passed, this uneasy truce began to crumble. Physical aggression and coercion poisoned the relationship between Cortez and his host. Cortez was fed some startling news. Spaniards were being murdered victim paid her death.
He becomes concerned about what he sees as plots against the Spaniards. And all of this comes to a head during the celebrations of the Mexica month of Toshkat, the creme de la creme of the Mexica nobility are engaged in a ritual dance in one of the major courtyards. Alvarado believes that this might be a triggering event for a rebellion, and so he orders his men to fire on the native celebrants, killing many of the leaders of the Mexica.
One Aztec account of the massacre describes how the Spaniards entered the sacred patio to kill people. They attacked the man who was drunk and cut off both his arms and his head. They struck others in the shoulders and tore their arms from their bodies. Some tried to escape, but the Spaniards murdered them at the gates while they laughed.
In any war, men who were willing to be violent without hesitation tend to rise up through the ranks, and that is Pedro Pablo. His entire career is about him being the man who's willing to stick his neck out to attack without mercy. He's psychotic, mass murderer, serial killer, I mean, whatever kind of modern anachronistic phrases you want to use. He's that kind of guy, the archetypal bad conquistador. They're not all like that, but he's about as bad as it gets.
Cortez comes back to
thrown an island city home to 250,000 people. It had taken him over 2 years.